AM 1240, 95.3 FM, WJON. It's time for another edition of Health Matters, and my guest today is Kari Collett, registered dietitian, aide to Zinc Nutrition. Hello, Kari.
Hi, Jay. How are you?
I'm good. So today we are talking about cardiometabolic disease. You'll have to explain. What is this?
I sure will explain that. So we all are familiar with the two main components of this disease, and the first one is heart disease, and the other one is diabetes. And as heart disease, it still remains as the number one cause of death in the United States. It's important to look at it. And diabetes is the seventh leading cause of death, and they oftentimes come together in a person. And so what we've started to do is look at this as their comorbidities, right? So we can't just look at one and treat it in isolation. We really have to look at both and treat them together. And that's now what we're starting to call cardiometabolic disease.
Okay, so you're looking at two things together.
Right, two things together, but because they so often occur together, now we're just seeing them as one thing with multiple parts rather than two parts that don't interact, but because they do interact.
Right. Mm-hmm. There is a lot of if you have one, you could have the other one.
Very likely.
Or that's a risk factor to the other one.
Definitely.
Okay, so what's the risk factors to getting cardiometabolic disease?
Well, there are definitely risk factors that we have control over and those that we don't. So, of course, we have absolutely no control over what gender we are when we're born. You know, men still have a greater risk of cardiometabolic disease than women, although the gap is closing, and I think that's really due to a couple of things. Lifestyles affecting women now just as much as men, because women are working. Women are not cooking like they used to. And women are living longer, so as they age, their risk increases with regard to getting diseases. Age, of course, we don't have any control over that. I mean, you were born when you were born, and every day you get older, and so the older you are, the greater your risk. And, of course, genes and family history. You don't have any control over the genes per se, but we do have some control over their expression. So if you have heart disease in your family, diabetes in your family, you definitely are at greater risk of obtaining and acquiring these diseases, but that's not a sure thing. It's not guaranteed that you will just because you have the genes for it.
Okay, so there's going to be some things that are risk factors you have no control over.
Right, yeah.
But how about the things you can control?
Absolutely. So definitely the number one all across the board, no matter what, biggest risk factor is smoking. So anybody who is currently smoking and you're starting to have health problems, that if you don't change anything else until you're ready, like diet and exercise and all that kind of stuff, that's a lot of work, quit smoking.
Smoking's the bad one. Yeah,
it is.
And we know about that. And I think people that are smoking, they know what they're doing, and in some cases, they really have a hard time quitting.
They really do. And I think that even after you quit smoking, people still continue to pay the price, but it's better to quit than to continue. Smoking just causes oxidative damage, and I don't know if we've ever talked about that in this show, Jay, but oxidative damage is those oxygen particles that circulate in your body have nowhere to go, so they attach to different things because they're unstable. They need to stabilize, so they attach to things that they're not supposed to attach to, and now we have oxidative damage. And so that's what smoking does. It multiplies oxidative damage so much that our bodies can't handle it, and that's really what causes, well, not only lung disease and things like that, cancer and things, but related to heart disease, it's what causes that hardening of the arteries, because that's where those oxidative particles attach, is the arteries, and that's what leads to heart disease. What
are some of the other changeable risk factors that we haven't touched on yet?
Yeah, so definitely elevated lipid profiles, so your cholesterol levels, your triglyceride levels, things like that. We have to be really careful about that one, though, because even though elevated lipids are a risk factor, they're not a causative factor. So not everybody that has elevated lipids will have a heart attack. Only about 50% of the people that have heart attacks have elevated lipids, but it is still a risk factor. It's something to pay attention to. Blood pressure, definitely, that's the most silent and one of the most deadly conditions is high blood pressure, because you don't oftentimes know when you have high blood pressure, but that is a definite precursor to heart disease.
Does your blood pressure vary depending on what you're doing in the day, or is it remain pretty constant?
Well, it can vary, especially under times of stress. Your blood pressure will increase because we need increased blood flow in certain situations that present to us as if they were dangerous. But if we have elevated stress long-term, that elevates our blood pressure long-term. That's really only intended for short-term use, and so then that can lead to consequences for that, for sure.
Sure. So how about obesity?
Definitely. We know this all across the board that if you are overweight, you're at risk of a lot of things, but especially heart disease and diabetes. And it's not as much obesity or BMI that's the concern. It's whether or not you have a large waist. So if your waist circumference is equal to or greater than half of your body height, that's a problem. So
give me an example.
So, for example, I am 5'3", so that is 63 inches, correct? So half of 63 is 30, let's just go 32.
Okay.
So if my waist size was 32 inches or more around, well, I would be huge. And that would be a risk factor for cardiometabolic disease. If it's less than that, of course, I'm not in the clear if I'm still overweight, but the risk factor just isn't as strong. So I would want my waist circumference to be, 30 inches or less.
Okay. So those are factors that people got to take a look at.
Absolutely. And that's not one that's often talked about with your doctor. They just look at BMI.
Yeah.
And we really want to look at, okay, but you can be overweight, but it's where the fat is that's important. We don't want adipose tissue in the abdominal area.
So obesity certainly is a factor, but, well, let's get a break now. Before we get into the next one, we kind of got carried away there. I got to get to a break now. Our guest today is Kari Collett, registered dietitian, A to Zinc Nutrition. We're talking about cardiometabolic disease. This is Health Matters. We're back after this. AM 1240 and 95.3 FM, WJON. My guest today is Kari Collett, registered dietitian, A to Zinc Nutrition. Today we're talking about cardiometabolic disease. All right, Kari, we're discussing some of the changeable risk factors. Obesity, diet.
Yeah.
I mean, certainly if you change your diet, then maybe you're not obese, but diet's a big factor.
Diet's a big factor. So, yeah, you can certainly cut calories if you're obese and start cutting back on your fats and back on your, just food intake in general. But what you eat is just as important as how much you eat. And so you can cut back on processed foods, but you're less likely to reduce weight with processed foods, less likely to reduce blood pressure with processed foods. So the focus there really then is you're in control of what you eat, when and how much. Let's get you switched over to whole foods. Even if you just take out the processed, that can make a big difference. I don't even care if you cut calories. That alone can make a big difference.
Will you lose weight?
If you're eating whole foods, absolutely. Because the thing with whole foods is that because they're inclined to support good function of your immune system, they're less inflammatory. And so even though you might be eating the same number of calories that you were before, the food is anti-inflammatory. It's got more fiber, more nutrients. So you're going to lose weight because your body's not under as much stress.
So diet is oftentimes accompanied with exercise. Okay, so if you are not exercising, well, I guess any exercise would be changing your habits.
Absolutely.
What do you suggest when it comes to exercise in regards to changing your risk factor?
So if you're not doing any exercise, start simple. Start with something easy and doable, affordable, and manageable. Walking. I mean, so let's just say you take a 5-minute walk every day at lunch. I mean, that's better than nothing. The other thing about exercise is pick things that you enjoy. So whatever it is you like to do, just do more of it. Instead of, if you hate going to the gym every day, don't do that. Instead of doing that, do something like maybe you enjoy playing a little bit of hockey with your friends, or maybe you enjoy biking or something like that. So just do that more. The other thing that makes exercise a little bit less daunting and more fun is to do it with somebody. Do it with a friend or a spouse or kids or whatever. Make it more than just, oh my gosh, I have to work out, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. If it becomes a chore, it's pretty difficult to stick with it.
Exactly.
How about stress?
Yeah, stress, and maybe we could even talk about sleep in this case too. Stress and sleep are really important to keep your health in line. So if you're stressed all the time, you have elevated cortisol levels all the time. Elevated cortisol levels all the time, we've already talked about a little bit, eludes or starts to result in high blood pressure. Elevated cortisol levels can also kind of create an environment where we're not supporting that antioxidant support, where those oxidative stressors come in and we can't derail them like we want them to. We can't stabilize them as well. So that's the cortisol thing. And then sleep, of course, because it's restful and it's a healing time. If you don't get good sleep, you're going to stay stressed more, and then you're going to have more risk of obesity, more risk of hypertension, and so on and so forth.
So it all kind of ties together.
It all does, yeah.
How about warning signs?
Well, the one that I love to talk about the most is insulin resistance. And a lot of doctors will say, yeah, we're not going to run any tests about your insulin levels because that's not standard of care. We'll test your blood glucose levels. But what's really interesting, Jay, is that your insulin levels start to rise long before your blood glucose levels rise through a blood test, right? Because as you go in and get your blood levels tested, your blood glucose levels tested, they stay low for a period of time because your insulin is working really, really hard. Well, so if you're at risk based on some other factors, you should just be proactively testing your insulin levels on an annual basis because those will elevate before blood glucose levels will. So that could be your very first warning sign that something is off, and then you could fix it before you ever even get elevated blood glucose levels. Because once you get elevated blood glucose levels, your insulin has stopped working very well, or your body stopped producing it because it was working so hard before that.
So you can't get it to start working again.
Well, not unless you make some significant changes. And that's why, so a lot of doctors will say that's not a reliable test. It's not used regularly. And they're right, it's not used regularly. It's a little bit more expensive than running blood glucose, but insist on it. I mean, that's you're the driver of the bus. You can say,
right,
absolutely, no, I want this test. I want this information.
Yeah, because that's going to make it so then you know what kind of risk factor you're faced
right,
with.
Exactly. You can catch diabetes before it's even pre-diabetes then, really.
Okay. And one of the warning signs that were next one on the list, blood pressure, we discussed that when it came to risk factors, but what is the warning sign? What should you be looking for?
Anything above normal, really. Anything above, and I have my cheat sheet here, anything above 120 over, I think it's like maybe 80 or 90 or something like that. Anything that is a warning sign that your body's under stress. It may not be specific to heart disease or diabetes, but it will lead to that eventually. And here's what happens is a lot of times if we ignore that warning sign, or even if we don't, maybe our doctors are going to recommend medication. Well, then the medication further increases nutrient deficiencies, and so then we end up creating more stress for the body because we're getting deficient in things that medication is interfering with.
What is the medication oftentimes?
I'm trying to think now. I know if I heard it, I would.
Is there
a
a thinner that they have you take for that or not?
Blood thinners, no, that's more for if you're at risk of
heart attacks,
heart attack or blood clots or things like that, stroke, things like that.
Okay.
Or if you've had a heart attack, then you might need that blood thinner.
Right. But there's certainly some natural ways that you can reduce your blood pressure.
For sure. Well, exercise and eating well is one, reducing sodium, but blood pressure we often think of as a high sodium intake correlation, right? And there's some truth to that. But high sodium intake maybe isn't the problem. Maybe it's that there's under intake of other nutrients, specifically potassium and magnesium. Magnesium is really key to blood pressure normalization. So,
Kari Collett is our guest today. This is Health Matters in WJON. Kari is a registered dietitian from A to Zinc Nutrition. We're talking about cardiometabolic disease. Back after this.